first of the environmental justice seminar series, which is being offered this spring. There will be 4 of these total. And this is the series that's really focused on practitioners and academics and who are leading examples of integrating justice into research, policy, education, and building community. So my name is Chris Edgar, and I'm the Director of Graduate Studies in the Natural Resources Science and Management program. We are a program of about 70 graduate students, and I see many of them here today, which is great. And we've got students doing projects in many different natural resource disciplines across multiple departments, working with many different faculty across the university and our affiliate organizations and institutions. So in November, Audrey, Anu, and Alana approached me and Jennifer Welch with an idea. And they said, we have an idea for an environmental justice seminar, and we would be willing be interested if you would be willing to hear about it and possibly support it. And they presented a really compelling idea. And we then conducted a survey of all of our graduate students and presented this option with 8 others, professional development activities, and said, which of these is the highest priority for you? And this one by far ranked at the top in terms of our students wanting to have this as a professional development opportunity. So you all picked a good one that had a lot of support. So we were very happy to be able to contribute. This is your collegiate fees at work. So if you've always wondered what happens to those collegiate fees, we'll be applying that to the support that we'll be providing. And not just us, but the Natural Resources Department of Forest Resources, the Minneapolis-Saint Paul Long-Term Ecological Research, and of course, NRAGS is the big supporters. And so we're just happy to be part of it. And it's my pleasure to be able to welcome you. I'll turn it over to Mireille and Anu.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anu Willie. I am one of the co-presidents of NRAGS, which is the Natural Resources Association of Graduate Students. I won't take up too much of your time because I know we all want to hear Joe speak, but basically we are a grad student organization committed to fostering social support as well as professional development and community advocacy within our graduate student body. And environmental justice has really been a core tenet of ours, and this series was really, a lot of the groundwork was done by students. And so we're really excited that we got to be involved in this series and see it come to life. So thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn it over to Mireille.
Thank you, Anu. As Anu said, I'm Mireille Gunther, and I'm the other co-president of NRAGS. And I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today. So our first speaker of the Environmental Justice Series is Joseph Vital. Joe is a South Minneapolis community organizer who advocates with the East Phillips Neighborhood Institute. The East Phillips is a primarily low-income and racially diverse community, and the East Phillips Neighborhood Institute aims to redevelop an existing building into a state-of-the-art community-owned site that will be the home to an indoor urban farm, affordable housing, and small business spaces, among other supportive local features, which I'm sure Joe will speak about in just a moment. And Joe shares his activism in many forms. He has had podcast appearances and features on local news, and is here to speak with us more today. So please join me in welcoming Joe Vital.
And could we just give it again to the amazing organizers that did everything to make this happen? Well, Audrey, everybody. Chimagwich, you know, there's something new in the air, and I'm not talking about toxic air pollution. There is something new in the air that environmental justice is coming for environmental science and environmental policy. For a long time, what did environmental justice mean? It was kind of top-down policy making created by politicians, staff at all levels, with very little input from community members for the areas of development or laws that were being created that were impacting them. But now things are changing. And we see this with this example right here with the East Phillips Urban Farm Project. an 8-year-long fight for the Roof Depot site, using it for the control, for community development, both culturally, economically, and socially. And we're gonna get into that now, but I just wanted to say it's an honor to be here before so many of you all, the future, and I truly mean this, showcasing, what it is folks are doing on the ground to help you, with your development in the future. So I didn't know this was quite the first, so I hope I don't, disappoint, but at the same time, honored. And those of you in the chat, ask your questions. I'll be here for an hour at least. Let's get it. Okay. And we're just gonna start straight up. Back in 2015, the East Phillips residents discovered that the former owner of the Roof Depot site that sits on 28th and Longfellow wanted to sell his property, wanted to move on. And so residents pooled together state funding along with plans developed by DGR Architecture, who we will talk about later on, with a multi-use site that included an indoor urban farm, cultural space, world-class kitchen, a jobs training facility for folks returning, and then all this powered by a solar array. And here, we see that the city is kind of going against this, because for decades, what the community did not know is that the city already had a plan for this site that never disclosed because of how rezoning works. And for those of you who are, many of you will probably know what rezoning is, but at least in the city, it happens every decade. And it's kind of done through a committee, the Zoning and Policy Committee, done behind closed doors. And most often who show up there are developers who understand the codes and the procedures that go along with all of these things. Places that community members would not show up because on top of everything, these meetings happen at 9:30 in the morning, and working class people can't take the time or certainly cannot be there. And right now the city is trying to demolish the Roof Depot site where it sits on top of an arsenic plume, and to expand its current works facility that is neighboring it to consolidate its entire truck fleet. That means it would bring, a total of 565 additional trucks, which would increase the truck traffic in the morning by 150%, and then 58% in the evening. And East Phillips, as I'll go through this presentation, is a predominantly BIPOC community, very low income. The average income there is about $33,000 annually for a household, and it drops significantly in Little Earth, and that's around $10,000 annually. So we're talking about a very diverse, very poor neighborhood, and the city's plans is to consolidate all of this. And we're seeing it right here, air quality, economic development, energy, environment, food, and the city fails to meet all of these needs because with the loss of Roof Depot is economic opportunity. The solar energy array that we were talking about, more importantly, the harm on the environment and the people that live there, the loss of food. East Phillips is a food desert. Housing, in part of the, urban farm plan, there's a plan for 120 deeply affordable housing units there, something that Minneapolis desperately needs as we are in a housing crisis, at least an affordable housing crisis. Transportation, you're gonna build a truck stop next to the Greenway, make it make sense. And then community. City had these plans long before community was alerted, and they kind of went under and behind the community's back when it purchased the site, which we were told by the owner later on that the city threatened eminent domain. So the owner wasn't even trying to sell to the city initially, but then with the threat of eminent domain, which is kind of the forced taking of a land or private property by a municipality, it's rarely used, but it is used when it's deemed for the good of the people, which can be a little dicey. And then kind of why we're all here, no one likes arsenic in the sky, and further air pollution in the areas, something we cannot afford. And we'll talk about cumulative impacts later on. And then the goals. This was developed by community. Here are some things we were trying to do. I talked about the housing units, the energy from the solar array, which if developed would be the largest urban solar array in the entire state. Roof Depot, 7.5 acres, 280,000 square feet is the building itself, with the other half of it just undeveloped parking space. And there would be some development that would be done if the community got site control, but it could be, the building itself could be retrofitted, mitigated, and up and running in 6 months, according to our architects and developers. And again, the economic opportunity, East Phillips is a deeply poor area. These are jobs. We want to connect them to green jobs such as solar panel maintenance, electrical vehicle maintenance, jobs for the future, indoor urban farming and those techniques, because I don't know who here is a farmer or who have friends that are farmers, but it's very difficult to have a stable income when you're working for half the year, at least in Minnesota. So with an indoor urban farm, you'd be able to, bypass a lot of that because you're working year round with very advanced equipment, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. And then again, improving the air quality in the neighborhood, because East Phillips, it's more than the Roof Depot site, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but there are other industry in the area. And so here are the topics we'll be going through. Shout out to my face. For those of you who are online, feel free to scan the QR code that will take you to the link tree of the East Phillips Neighborhood Institute, who has been the steering committee that has been fighting for community control for the last 8 years. And then I apologize. It's like kind of who I am. You got a little bit of an introduction, but my involvement with this is about 2 years. I was the chair of the Native Peoples Caucus back in 2020, left that when community in Little Earth asked me to kind of make this my primary focus to help them win. And, I've been one of the lead organizers in this fight ever since. So, but back to this, some of the topics will get underway. We'll be discussing cumulative impacts, more importantly, where things stand, and then how can you help? Afterwards, if there are any additional questions, we'll go through that. Now, here is a great picture of the site. Here is Roof Depot itself, 280,000 square feet. This is Smiley's Clinic. This actually sits on top of what used to be the kind of ground zero of the Arsenic Triangle. The Arsenic Triangle is in fact all of this on 28th going up. And then it also included the Roof Depot site. And right above it is the current waterworks yard for the city. Now, I say waterworks, but there's no tower. There's actually no water treatment that is happening in this facility, nor will there be water treatment happening in the expansion project itself. Again, it's a consolidation project that is there to move all of the city's fleets and equipment that does do important work for maintenance of the city. Potholes are bad. We want those filled. You know what I'm saying? Storm drains, clean them so we're not flooding. All important stuff. No one's trying to say that. But this is what we're working with right here. We see a nice little picture of the Greenway. And there goes the iconic Roof Depot water tower. And the city wants to demolish this site to expand it, which again, community is very fearful that it would expose them to arsenic. Arsenic exposure is not something new in this community. There was an exposure in the early 2000s, which cleanup took over almost a decade to happen. And there are still sites in East Phillips that are still considered a Superfund site because their soil has not been remediated. But that's on private land, and it gets a little bit difficult for government to get on private land. There's about 5 houses left. Now we've talked about, the why a little bit, but I really want to jump into it. East Phillips is home. It's a food desert. Heat island effect is very real here. The neighboring community is very poor, very diverse. It's very difficult for them to fight back, especially development at this scale and size, especially when it's the government, which has unlimited funds to kind of do whatever it wants. However, with this in the past 8 years, what we've seen is different innovations of this battle taking place. We've seen it happen in City Hall. We've seen it happen on the streets through art creation, and then, further art creation that we see right there. And what we've seen time and time again is that the community needs this. And we're not saying that, community control over Roof Depot is going to solve the environmental injustices that East Phillips currently experiences, but it's a fucking start. Because this model of capitalism and consumption that we see right now are hurting people. And they're especially hurting people like those who live in East Phillips. And that's what this is all about. Environmental justice, which is, folks from any class, culture, or race having and community having a say in what their community looks and feels like. And that's what this is. Now, here's nice visuals created by DGR Architecture about what some of the components could look like in the urban farm project. You'll see it right there at the top left, the solar arrays, the reorientation and development of the green zone, all of this for community use, all of this for community control. Because healthy foods, thick greens, leafy greens, help clean out the blood from, toxic air exposure that folks are living with, job training opportunities to lift people out of poverty, and bike shops because, well, it's right next to the greenway. It only makes sense, am I right? And a cultural market. I'm Anishinaabe. I'm a citizen of the Red Lake Nation, and I'm also a proud Mexican. And at least growing up, it was very difficult to get my hands on walleye, which is a staple of the Anishinaabe people. And I know I'm not alone in that. I shouldn't have to go to Red Lake to feel connected to my own people. And, East Africans live in the neighborhood, and it's hard to eat healthy when the foods that you have available don't reflect your culture. Because I didn't grow up eating bread that much. I grew up eating a tortilla or rice. And so trying to decolonize the diets of the people that live in the area. Now, I talked about this has been very grassroots, community-led for 8 years. Absolutely has. And the ownership of the building needs to reflect that because greenwashing is a real concern with any type of project. We've seen a lot of things go wrong with, raising the housing prices around an area after development is completed, absolutely pushing out the people who needed to benefit from it the most. However, with this, what we're trying to do is mitigate that through an ownership model that looks like 3-3-3. So a third of, stocks that you'd call it, with this site in its completion would be owned by the community. Third by renters. And then third from outside investors, because this model will need outside investment to make it happen. And we'll have a slide on showcasing who these initial investors have looked like. And we're looking at cooperative models, potentially a new nonprofit that needs to be created, run, and owned by the community. A couple years back, I think back in the spring of 2021, the community came together to talk about this model. And it actually voted on an action on what to do with the proceeds. And folks were talking about buying baby bonds so that when new members of the community are born in the area, they're issued a baby bond that matures when they're 18, and then there they have funds for college or for a down payment on a car or a home to start building, that economic resiliency that we're currently not seeing at the moment. So not only are the structures viable, but the community has the capabilities to make decisions to benefit themselves. And we're always trying to listen to them and seeing what they need. And well, it's a capitalistic system. So we had to prove that this thing is viable. And we had an internal audit done by a financial consultant. And well, surprise, surprise, we can make money off this thing. Make a little over $2 million a year. And this is all profit. That's after expenses. And I don't, well, am I seeing it? Rents, insurance, nah, insurance, fun. We're missing the solar array on this slide, my apologies, but that would hit close to $500,000 annually with Roof Depot's site, with everything, you know, the aquaponics done with indoor urban farm, cultural market, all the electricity generated by the site would use about 2% of the electricity we produce. Boom. Some of the initial investors that we've seen, and they've been categorized for, well, why they've been interested. We have folks who are just interested in office space, because for those of you who, you know, rent rooms in community, public space is at a premium at the moment. It's really, really hard to have a consistent space just to hold a meeting, a community gathering, or even a celebration in Minneapolis. So we've allocated about 20,000 square feet of the 280,000 square feet for a public use space for our neighbors. And in that includes offices, you know, for Little Earth Residents Association, which is the office space that kind of runs Little Earth. OMG Media Solutions, which is, you know, a beats maker. And then we have the Blue Water Farms, who would manage our aquaponics systems. And then the Somali American Farmers Association, that have a deep interest in the indoor urban farm aspect of it. And then we have folks who just want to maintain or own the solar array. We have McGeezy, who wants to do programming with their students to get, you know, some hands-on training. And then Cooperative Energy Futures have also discussed, you know, partially owning or helping with the funding, or to get funding for that, to make the solar array happen. And then retail, the Latino Economic Development Center wants to place some storage, you know, refrigeration space for their businesses on Lake Street. A lot of Latino businesses, a lot of food, just not enough space. Again, space, space, space. And God dang it, besides the city, so many people support this project. You see it from all across the political spectrum, from the American Indian movement to neighborhood associations, to autonomous groups like Southside Harm Reduction, to the nonprofit industrial complex itself, from NACD, Minnesota Interfaith and Power, to our comrades at Twin Cities DSA. A lot of folks see the vision of how this can not only benefit the community, but also the things that they're fighting for, their own mission statements. Go ahead. But damn. So here's a close-up of what the city's current water yard looks like. You can see all these parking spaces, and these trucks typically, you know, move unmelted asphalt, and they want to centralize all of these. The current other locations, there's one next to Herc, or the garbage incinerator in downtown Minneapolis, and another at the East Hennepin Yard by Marcy Homes. And we see here what the city's expanded project would look like. So they have a parking garage, and all these little markers are parking spaces, and there's 888 of them total, including what's in the parking garage. And, you know, just to make things especially good, there's a fueling station there. And the city's argument for this, and let me know because a lot of you are way smarter than I am, is that we're actually lower emissions with this project because there's Hiawatha, Cedar Avenue, and Lake Street close by, so it can get to and from any part of the city by centralizing it here. So you're lowering the emissions because you're reducing the travel time of trucks and cars. Okay, that makes sense to me. My issue is you might be lowering the emissions of like Minneapolis in general, but at least in my head, you're consolidating it here, right? Because this is the center point of it all. And so that's the basis of why the community is fearful of what is to come, because we see it as genocide. Violence looks different nowadays too. Violence is no longer blatant racism. I mean, we can put it in our urban planning projects, absolutely, but it's more subtle. This violence, this genocide, because this is a majority Indigenous community, this is a majority BIPOC community, but in decreasing the air quality in this area will only exacerbate the, asthma rates, lead contamination, and arsenic exposure that folks are already dealing with right now. So this violence looks different. It might take a little bit longer to kill people, but ultimately it will. And this is what racist urban planning looks like. So a little bit of history. East Phillips was built by design. It was initiated back in the 1930s, and it was yellow lined. We're all very used to, or we're very familiar with like redlining, correct? East Phillips is yellow lined. It's like a tier lower, but still significantly bad, where certain mortgages up to a point were allowed. All right, but it was still a designated area. And per Minneapolis' own maps, it was always meant as a place for undesirables, immigrant populations, Jewish folks, Norwegian folks, at least back in the day. But East Phillips has always been a place for the city's undesirables. The immigration or undocumented folks might look different, but it's still the same. Because now we have Latinx, our relatives from the South, East Africans who live here, who have been placed here strategically because we have a roofing company, Smith Foundry, bituminous roadways, Hiawatha that cut through the community, Cedar Avenue, all things and places that, well, you need to get to the city somehow, but we're not going to put it in Southwest Minneapolis. We're moving things away, but we'll center it here. We needed industry to go somewhere, and East Phillips was put on the chopping block. This is what environmental racism looks like. And I talked about ground zero. This was during the cleanup during the Superfund site days. And the arsenic, where did that come from? Well, as I mentioned, racism. Now, there was a storage facility that ran from the 1938 to 63. It was a pesticide plant that would transfer pesticide to farms. There's the railway, which is now the blue line. They would use that to transport arsenic. However, they didn't really top it off, so it would just fly to the adjacent neighborhood. And they did this for decades. And this wasn't spotted until the 1990s by the Department of Agriculture. But then they themselves admitted that the contamination is so severe, they need to go to the EPA. And that's when the EPA designated it as a very unique Superfund site for arsenic. And cleanup started in 2002, didn't stop till 2009. My own home, I had folks come with hazmat suits to take and dig up the soil in my backyard. Luckily, we used topsoil, so we never really dug into the ground. But I grew up in a predominantly Mexican or Spanish-speaking neighborhood where my mother speaks English and Spanish, so she could translate these government documents. But they all came in English, so I could only think now, my relatives, my friends, as an 8-year-old, how do you translate soil contamination to your parents who don't speak English or who don't have past a 5th grade, education level? And this happened. And later on, after remediation, Smiley's Clinic was built on top of this, which now serve the community, those who are on Medicare and Medicaid. And the problem is, when they demolished that building, they did so during remediation, dug it out. That's where the concern comes again with Roof Depot, because we say with the site remaining up That's actually harm reduction because it's not folks being exposed to the, that toxic chemical. Yep. And this is, the area that the EPA had to dig out the soil. It's why. There on 27th, that was my neighborhood. And here are just, other chemicals we're dealing with. This has been covered. We talked about podcasts and such, but it hasn't just been me. There's been opinion pieces, interviews of other community members that have taken place throughout this decade. There's a deep history of the community crying out to the city, do the right thing. Be transparent with your arsenic remediation procedures, which is not to this day. We're getting a trust us, it'll be fine. When Braun Intertech is the advisor on the arsenic remediation, which we all know Braun Intertech was also the advisor during line 3. And the pipelines ended up spilling anyways. So how do we trust that as Indigenous people? And now, what do people do when they're not being heard? Direct action? I don't know. But there's hope. But with that hope has come a lot of travesty. I've met with city council members, the mayor, many a time. And they've always asked me, well, this is going to be expensive to move. Or don't you want clean water? Because remember, the site is being advertised as a water maintenance facility, and it's not. No water treatment's taking place there. But they are moving their water department staff on site. That's sick, but no water treatment. And the hope, again, do I want clean air? Yes. Do I want clean water? Absolutely. But I also want that for generations to come. That's what East Phillips is begging for, have been begging for. And we lose people to environmental racism. Pictured, in the middle is my sister, Cassandra Holmes, who lost her son, Trinidad, to a heart problem he wasn't born with. It just developed because the air is so polluted. And this isn't the first example of this. I've grown up with friends who I've then lost because of cardiovascular, related issues they were not born with, that they developed asthma later on, where I remember playing with them. They did not have that. Or also growing up with folks, seeing them slowly become nebulized. It's real. And again, the site would only exacerbate the issue that already exists. We're losing relatives today. But we've talked about the site, we've talked about the plan. Let's talk about the people. It's over here. And East Phillips is a diverse area, poor. I've talked about that. But what I need to make real is it's resilient. They're educated, they're strong-willed, they're loving, they're caring. They don't care what creed you come from because when you're there, you're community. They want the best for each other, for themselves. It's only represented in the movements that have come, in the coalition that has been built and sustained. They keep them up. It's home of Little Earth, the only Indigenous preference housing for Section 8 in the entire nation. I said at the beginning of the presentation, the average income here is $10,000 a year, $10,000 a year. And it's a little fucked up to say, because don't y'all live on like that too? The ramen noodle diet? Not to joke too bad. Pay them. But within these households, it's not like a traditional nuclear family. Like I grew up partially in Little Earth, and my grandma lived there. So you can see 3 or 4 generations living in one household, living off of $10,000 a year. And it's located less than half a mile away from the site. And here's a breakdown of the percentages based on the census. And the poverty line. And it seems to be a replication, but again, using the time, the resources that they have, more important, the specialty, to keep up this fight. And seeing this resiliency and the showcase of culture has just been inspiring, at least for me. I'm just a talking piece, but see that. Now we'll talk about the toxic air pollution that exists here. We talked about the industry that exists. We'll really get into it. And you see the location and proximity of the Little Earth community, not too far away. And to think that the city's own plans would increase heavy duty, vehicle truck rotations in the area by 150% is something scary to think about, at least in the morning. And this is all still the arsenic triangle. Here's a nice quote from the MCEA, who supported EPNI during its legal process back in 2022. I like the end of it, the neighborhood. It's using the neighborhood to further pollution, forcing residents to live adjacent to another industrial site. And could you go back quickly, just because I want to? East Phillips is inside of a green zone. And a green zone is a policy that was created by the city of Minneapolis back in 2017. And basically it was highlighted as this area in particular is high percentages of residents of color, poor, and have some of the worst air quality in the state. So what are we as a city gonna do? Further green infrastructure development in the area, do traffic calming to decrease, the number of cars that come through the area. And then lastly, create a resident advisory council that would make recommendations on policy. Now the city did one thing, created a resident advisory council, the green zones. This is the south side green zone. And in the north side, there is a sister north side green zone next to Northern Metals, where they have their own site, the Herc incinerator. So they did one thing. And now they want to increase traffic in the area, further polluting the neighborhood. So going against their own policy. So it makes you wonder, and going back on the discussion on environmental justice, which is people having control over what their neighborhoods look and feel like. How do we hold these powers accountable? And here's just the arsenic exposure broken down. There's also the consideration of some of the cardiovascular that I talked about. So the darker the color, the more concentrated it is. Now, cumulative impacts. It's something that's going to be ongoing now that the EPA is soon going to unveil what their plan is for cumulative impacts, because that is something at least municipalities that I've seen all the way up to the state don't know exactly how to deal with, which is just adding this much more pollution just exacerbates the problem. And it makes sense, but it doesn't make sense to the policymakers at the moment. And this little graphic kind of showcases that. So this is kind of what already exists in East Phillips and what the city's project would do, which would break the camel's back. This is what environmental justice looks like. And just going back to, the arsenic that already exists and the fear of that exposure. Now, there is arsenic underneath the current building, Roof Depot, and it was done so because Roof Depot was constructed in the 1950s. So the arsenic, when it was kind of flying out of the rail tracks and such, got encapsulated underneath during construction. And that's how we know it got there. In fact, all over East Phillips, if you travel there, you'll see these protruding wells that come out. And those are testing wells that the city uses to actually track this thing because it is slowly moving southwest. What was that? Good. And now we're going to go really deep into the components of the alternative plan that the community has, proposed. Here's a nice little zoom in on what it is. Now, we're talking cumulative solutions because, the community's plan isn't perfect, but it gets to the deep roots, causes of the injustices that the neighborhood experiences. But it's that or more cumulative impacts. Here are some of the arguments about what the city can, but is actually doing, is not doing. And policy. Back in 2017, as I said, the green zones were created. 2020, we declared a climate emergency. Remember that? And then racism is a public health crisis. But what happens when the city's own plans are environmental racism? That exasperates current environmental injustices. What does that mean then? Nothing really. Here are some of the definitions of environmental racism, the World Economic Forum. And just as an Indigenous person, I always love, I love this quote at the bottom: America is in a state of denial about its racism and unequal impacts of environmental exposures. And we see that with Roof Depot, where council members will argue, well, pollution levels will go down because the trips will be shorter for our workers, right? But again, it's that consolidation that is the problem. The community can't afford any more of this. And, it's not only in the environmental exposure, but it's who benefits as well. And there's a slide coming up about it. More quotes. Bam. It's who benefits, because other people's air gets better. And so what we recently found out is, well, what are they going to do with the buildings they're so-called consolidating all of the equipment from? All of them are already being bid for developers to turn into condos. One was already accepted. It's going to be like a great multi-use complex with, apartments at the top, art gallery at the bottom, and a coffee shop. All amazing things. Don't get me wrong. We need more housing in Minneapolis. But where are those plans for East Phillips? Where are those plans for North Minneapolis? You're taking all of the crap, all of the city's harms, and consolidating it in areas that have high rates of people of color and poor folks. And this is the current water yard that exists. And another thing in this fight that community found is that there was an internal document that was created back in 2020, 2021, towards the tail end of that. It was through council action, where city council directed city staff to find alternative sites for the Hiawatha expansion project, which was a big victory because we wanted them to prove to us why here. Well, they only proposed the Fridley location, which was like a very, very controversial site in itself. And it split the council in half. But what they failed to report on was this internal document that was created on the current water yard that can hold all of, the city's equipment, as well as be a treatment center for the water as well. They never reported on it. And inside of the document, it said, this is and I'm paraphrasing, this is kind of like our last ditch effort, just in case things go belly up, meaning if city council sides with community again. Well, we have a nice spot to put everything. The sleight of hand that has been done. And it's a non-sanctioned document by city council because it was never formally presented on. That is the city's stance on this document. Not saying we don't know who wrote it, not denying a city staff member wrote it, but just denying its legitimacy because it was just never presented on. And some more on the community's plan. Now, East Phillips is a food desert, so we'd grow our own food. It'd be close to home, which we all saw during the pandemic, especially during the uprising after the murder of George Floyd. Where were folks getting their food? Little Earth itself became a food hub because students, those were two of their meals. Students weren't able to go to school anymore where they got breakfast and lunch. They were guaranteed a meal. So Little Earth became a food hub. Behind Little Earth as well is a farm that was used to feed the neighborhood. Now think of that, but on a massive, bigger scale with culturally relevant food, using aquaponics, fish, growing fish, and using the fish poop to grow, the plants and vegetables vertically so we can stack more and use more of the space. Cultural markets, the solar array, and the affordable housing. Training facility. It's a replication, but again, just a reminder, all community led. And again, this design was created by DJ Architecture, that is a nationally recognized firm. And these were based on relations that the community created itself. And again, a reminder that this is financially viable. And how we plan to make the money. Because up to this point, the city has said, give us $17 million and we'll give you the site. Not in portions, not as a payment plan, all of it. And if anybody has $17 million, see me after this presentation, please. Again, going back to the interested parties. Now, it's an update of where we're at because last month, City Council voted to demolish the building. Despite outcries from community members, you can see me and my ma right there, at least my 5-head. And so where things stand. Right now, we're appealing the judge's decision on our lawsuit to make a stay on demolition of the building. And the basis of our lawsuit is that the city is ignoring the Clark-Brooklyn law, which demands a cumulative impact analysis to be conducted on any type of development that takes place in East Phillips. It's a very unique law, the only one on cumulative impacts in the entire state. We're looking on broadening that as well, but we're basically saying you're not following the rules. But the city's argument against following the state law is that the emissions coming from its project is vehicle-based, meaning it's moving in and out and it's not stationary, so they don't have to abide by that state law. Yeah, they openly admit, yeah, we'll increase pollution, but it's moving around, so it's cool, right? I don't know, make it make sense. And again, what it's violating. Now the city, and this happens with community building all the time, in that, you build this resilient, at least core community group, and then there's a movement behind it. But no matter what you do, something will always try to derail or buy out, that type of engagement or opposition. There's been MOUs proposed, which we have rejected because it doesn't address the environmental concerns that community has. What are you going to do about the trucks? What are you going to do about the arsenic? Nothing in these MOUs indicate any type of, guarantee or even adherence to those concerns. It's just kind of trust us, it'll be fine, or we'll talk about that later, which is not possible. That's not up for negotiation. And we just told them, talk to our lawyers. And this is kind of an example of where those 3 acres would take place that the city offered in its MOU, which again, rejected. Now, when the city, approved the demolition, community came together, had a healing circle. There was drum, there was dances to come place in recognition that this fight is moving out of City Hall and to become something else. What that is, not sure. Direct action, further lobbying, anything is possible. Examples of some of the direct actions that have taken place. Little Earth. And quotes from the community members. Sandra Holmes, I feel like a lot of our medical issues are from pollution and environmental injustices. And how can you help? So we have this QR code, especially those seeing us virtually, that you can scan. Right now, we're in need of funds for our court cases. Sharing our information always helps. Again, thank you so much. I'm honored to be here to talk to you all about this important issue. Follow us, share our content. A lot of it's funny. And then subscribe to our mailing list to get updates. And, we've talked about capitalism and the current system that we're in. It hasn't worked out for a lot of people, at least my people. And this circular economy, I've heard it called, or a green economy, that is possible. And we can do that. Questions? All right. Do we have any questions? Anybody virtually? Or no? Or clarification that's needed? Yeah.
I'm wondering about social housing on the site.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, is it like Section 8 housing that's adjacent to it as well, or like how do you address like the potential effects of like increasing the property value of the surrounding land?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really hard to predict the market, especially nowadays. The one way we hope to mitigate that was through, offering shares. So right across from the site are just single family homes, where when you check on it, it would increase the property value. But right now with the city's project, you're seeing a decrease in property value. So we're hoping with those shares, with the payouts annually to folks, we're helping kind of at least covering some of the increased taxes that we see on folks' like, bills. And also, there's been discussion with Xcel Energy with the usage of, the electricity we generate to actually pay for people's, electricity. So handling some of the utilities, which should just be free, but it's another conversation. Yeah, and then you in the back.
How does Xcel think about the solar array? Because you mentioned that it will generate quite a bit more than the food outside. So you turn it into a utility yourself? Or?
Yeah, we would. We actually need their okay to make this happen, or just like state involvement, which the lieutenant governor has expressed interest. We're really fortunate, at least with our site plans, because there is a grid across from Roof Depot. So there's not a lot of electricity loss during that transference, but we'd be a small scale generator that, you know, we need. Pretty pleased from Excel. Yeah. Yeah, so, you know, the conversation was, you know, I've talked a lot about the lobbying efforts at the city level. What does that look like at the state level, especially, you know, in reference of the lieutenant governor? Last week, we joined with Honor the Earth, MNIPL, MN350. I think Sierra Club were also co-hosts of Rise and Reuse, which hundreds of folks went into the rotunda and advocated on, you know, state policy, and which one is the removal of Smith and bituminous roadways, one of the industry polluters in the neighborhood, which has been very hard to get out, for us to get them out, because they are grandfathered in, meaning they have existed in that community for so long that they're not held to the same environmental protection standards that we see for like newer developments or, you know, polluters. But if they were, they'd have to go relatively quick. Any other questions? Oh, yeah, yeah. You and then you.
Okay, it seems like the green zone, the plan, the city plan for the, you know, everything happening in the development, it seems like it contradicts the green zone plan as they wrote in the plan. Mm-hmm. Like, how did they come to that? How did they address, are they, like, didn't they have some sort of green zone plan in the that was addressed in Philip?
Yes, and in most of those is just allocation of tree planting designation. So like, yes, let's plant some more trees, which I love, but I think we get lost in tree planting where we forget about tree maintenance, because those things are not only expensive, but there's this thing called the ash borer that's kind of going straight through all of them at the moment, and there's no funds to protect the tax liens of, you know, property owners. You know, we saw that a couple months ago with North Minneapolis folks who they had this new bill on their tax lien, you know, and these tree replacements can cost anywhere between $2,000 to $5,000 per tree removal. And when you have 3 on a poor neighborhood, that's hard. So it's again, it's not really addressing the issue. Granted, trees do a lot of great things, and I'd rather have more of them than not, but that's not what we're talking about right here. They're not talking about removing industry polluters. They're just talking about easy fixes, which is something we've probably all seen in any type of government, right? Whether as big as the city or even here is, yeah, we'll go for the easy fix, but those like large scale, heavy investment fixes that we need to get to the root causes of things, you get hit again, you know, against a wall, pretty much. But one thing they did do with the 2040 plan is they made it an opportunity zone, which makes it really cheap to develop in the area. So it'd make it cheap for us to develop or just about anybody else. But the issue is the pollution and the lack of space.
So I know you mentioned that they you have the court case to stop developing or at least starting right now building. Mm-hmm. Because they don't have the environmental health assessment for their purpose.
Yeah.
Do they also need an assessment of the arsenal that is being held in place on the
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if anybody remembers, but this whole fight is so nuanced, and you saw like updated 2/10/2023 because there's so much nuance. The city's argument is that they're not digging deep enough to actually mess with the arsenic, which for years they were saying, well, we're going to remediate it. we're going to dig into there and actually take it out. And now they're saying they're not touching it at all. So in fact, they did not need to do that. They won't disturb the arsenic, which was a surprise to us. But again, they haven't been transparent with what exactly their methodology will be during deconstruction and construction. We've only ever heard from the Public Works Director, Margaret Anderson Keller, is that when they're demolishing, they're going to spray water in the air to capture some of the particles. Because arsenic does love water, it will bind pretty easily. But then what is the plan with stormwater or the soil that is nearby? Again, we don't know. The only current cumulative impact analysis they have had to do is on the stormwater, which they claim will be just fine.
We have a couple of questions on students that I think were summarized as there are a lot of ways for us to help as members of the community, but how can we also help as staff, students, faculty, and academics? Is there any specific to our position within the university that we could do to help further your goals or other environmental justice goals?
Yeah, within the QR, there's like a sign-on letter you could easily send, being professionals yourselves, expressing the concern to city council members, the harmful causes of arsenic on the human body. They seem to think it's negligible. Just letting them know, hey, you should think twice about this. There's so many things you could do. Power in numbers, just drown their email. And I would think priority right now should be city council, because we are hoping, keeping this in their forefront. This is not done, and trying to force them to do a revote. The thing with government, that we've learned in this community, development, is that there is always another vote. Nothing's ever quite done. And so we could force them to do this revote, move the site, and giving us control over their lobbyists at the state level. Yeah. So the question is, why did city council vote despite hearing the concerns from the community? One, it's expensive to move it. By then, when I got involved, $10 million had already been spent by the city on this project through the purchasing of the site and through their own architecture drawings of what it could look like. So they were already saying we're knee deep in this, so we might as well follow through. Second is, and I've heard this time and time again, is where's the community during these votes? Which I always respond to them is, the meeting's at 9:30 in the morning. People have to work. Like, I have to work. I'm fortunate enough to work remotely and flex, but who really flexes, am I right? But the argument has always been bull. But the truth is, and what I see as the truth, is that this site was promised to Public Works long before we knew about it. That's just the truth. And what we saw with the area being yellow lined, the city has its plans on what it wants the whole entirety of Minneapolis to look like, where they want these industries to go. And this is messing with their plans. On the other hand, are we good?
Yeah, that's it. So we do have a student reception in Newcomb 326 right after this. So if you're not a student, you're still welcome. But students, you will have food, and you'll be there to answer some questions and just kind of have a chat with yourself. So hopefully see you there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.